Hello and welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to go back and revisit the MetaHuman sample data that I first played with a while back, and I produced some of the first videos on this channel for. And I wanted to go back and just tinker a little bit more with the lighting settings and mainly the parameters in the movie render queue, just to see what differences it would actually make, because I looked into it a little bit further and I just really wanted to see what the comparison was, because I think looking at some videos online from people and some of the work they've been doing, it's interesting to see how they've set their parameters in the movie render queue, because I think some people, I'm not saying they're getting it wrong, but I do wonder whether or not the parameters they're setting actually do make a difference. And it's very easy to get this wrong because there's so many different variables to actually control and set there. Now, instead of just using the standard sample scene, I wanted to do my own lighting, and I wanted to have like a studio setup lighting, which is what I've got actually here. And the basis for this was I wanted to try and recreate or do kind of inspired by what's called the Paramount butterfly lighting. And if you Google this, there's plenty of information about this. And this is a lighting technique which was developed in the golden age of Hollywood by some of the early photographers who were producing the glamour shots for the actresses. And it was called the butterfly technique because it would give you this slight butterfly shape underneath the nose of the actress being photographed, and it had a very distinct style and technique to it, in that the person would always be looking straight into the camera, and also there'd be a light almost facing directly at the person, just at a slight angle to give the shadow. And there's lots of really good examples of this technique and its history, so it's really worth looking up, because this is how many of the lighting techniques that we know today first started. So I wanted to do my own kind of version of this, and you can see that it still gets used today. It's obviously been adapted and implemented for the more digital age, but the underlying theory is still basically the same. So this is my main opening shot that you see in the video. This is how it's lit, and I think there's a good contrast here. We've got a nice shape appearing under the character's nose. We've got most of it in shadow on one side, which is what you would expect. I didn't want to go too straight on with the lighting. I wanted to have the shadow off to just one side. And I've just got a nice little kind of key coming in here as well, just to show there's a little bit more shape there to the head as well. And I always prefer to, I think I changed the camera slightly just to zoom in, so I just got a little bit of a cut off here. So I kept it really simple. I didn't really want to play around with it. So once I got something working, I was really happy with that. Then I was able to do some renders. So what I did here, I went through a number of different variations. So first off, the machine that I'm using this on now is actually a virtual machine, but it's got a non-Raytraced video card in it, and it's got a Quadro P4000 card, so it's a decent card, pretty high end, and I'm able to easily go to cinematic on my engine settings and the material quality. I can really up it quite a lot on that, so this is really good, and it's a lot better than my machine I'd usually have at home. Now, the first version that I was going to render out would be to use the video capture here from the sequencer. And again, so this would be rendered out a PNG sequence. Wasn't going to do anything else. HD 1080. I did consider doing separate passes, but I thought, no, I'll just go simple, one frame, and that's really about it. So I did one render like that. Then I went into the movie render queue and chose my sequence. And just say I'll just choose this one here just so I can load up my presets. And the first thing I did, I went with the default settings that Epic provide with this sample scene, and just rendered it out vanilla. I didn't change anything. Now, the main aim here really was just to see what differences adding or changing these console variables will or can actually do, and also what difference does it make in the anti-aliasing settings. Because again, I've seen people just put numbers in here, and I think this is areas where many people don't really spend a bit of time or really look at the documentation. Epic actually provide some really good detailed information about this, and I think there comes a point where you can push this to a certain level and you're not really getting the gains I think you are. There's also what I did discover here in the console variables, that if you push this sample count beyond a certain value, then some of these don't really work, or you've got to change a few things because the way in which, say, ray tracing works has a different method or sampling to what's actually needed here. And Epic even provides you a list of saying, well, if I was you, I'd actually maybe consider turning these off because you're not going to get the gains you think you are, because you've already got the anti-aliasing set at or above a certain level. It's very easy to not understand what these variables do because it's very hard to find the reference for them. However, there is a neat little trick to find these out, and that is if you go to your output log and you just put help. That's it. Now you do that, and what will happen is it will generate here an HTML file, a console help HTML file, and every single console command variable is listed here, every single one. And it's worth doing that whenever there's an upgrade, really, because these will actually change. So all you've got to do now is, so if you put renderer here, it will shortcut everything for the renderer. And again, it gives you a description of what actually happens. So for example, you can choose here r.ambient occlusion method. Setting 0 or 1 will change the different models. You've got another one to look at as well for the ray tracing. You put r.raytracing, that should filter out. There we go. So again, you can turn it on and off here. Rather than going to the settings, you've got turn on the ambient occlusion, just simple on and off. And then you've got all the enabled materials, the samples per pixel, the culling. There's just an endless array of commands to actually set. And what's interesting as well is that if you were to set a new project, now apparently, depending on what you choose here, some of those variables are turned on and off by default. Because they're designed to work with the particular data and environment that these are set for. So again, it's worth just looking at that as well. But this is why I found a lot of really good information here about what to do. For example, if we go to one of the ones I used was depth of field. And you've got here depth of field quality. And straight away, you can see here, just by setting these values, and it will give you the default. And so, well, here's the default. It's either on or it's off. You can then set the blur, the depth of field blur scale, but the quality is the main one. And it's got here like Gaussian is 0 or off. Otherwise, it's on automatically. And these are things that are really worth considering. But I think the other thing to consider as well is that these commands will they will work depending on how you're using the engine in the first place. And I think that's the key thing. From my point of view, I'm looking at it to produce rendered frames. I'm not making a game and I'm not playing it in real time. So those variables will have different impacts and influencing depending on how you're using the engine. So for me, I want to try and push my final frame rendered out, push that quality as far as I can. So if I was to turn on some of those, it will probably break if I was trying to play at 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second in a real-time game environment. But that's not my that's not the purpose I'm using it for. And vice versa, there'll be if I wanted to not do that and use it for that real-time environment, then some commands are going to apply as well. But yeah, it's really worth checking out. So yeah, if you need them, remember, just type in help and it will generate your own HTML file, and then you can host it wherever you want, really, and it's there for you to refer to whenever you need it. Now, when it comes to the documentation that Epic provide, there's actually a lot of really useful information here. And I know this is often an area which many people overlook, but it's really worth taking the time to look through some of this, because there's some really, really good and useful information, and some real nuggets or gems of information here, which otherwise might go unnoticed. So under RayTrace rendering, there's a setting that says how to use the Movie Render Queue for high quality renders. And I've just scrolled down to step 6, which is about the anti-aliasing settings. So here it talks about the differences between the spatial samples and then the temporal samples. And it actually gives you a good baseline setting here as well, about the spatial count, the temporal sample count, and then overriding the anti-aliasing mode. And when you do this, it really does change a few things, and then you can add, you've got then more scope to change things how you want. So this is what I usually set my my parameters to, regardless of whether I'm doing ray tracing or not. I found them often work. Again, if you want to do quick renders, you can just dial down this sample count here from 64 maybe to something like 8, or you can even maybe up the spatial count as well, just if you want to do some quick draft renders. And then down here it talks about the console variables, and again it gives you some good baseline settings here to start off with. So again, regarding the first 5 here, these are going to work regardless of whether or not you're doing ray tracing or not. And then these ones here obviously are going to be dependent upon whether or not you're using ray tracing. And again, just got to be a little bit careful with some of these and think about how your render is going to look. But what it does talk about is what happens when they're turned on and off. And again, you've got different, it's not a simple thing of just turning global illumination on or off. There's a value here to set as to what method to use. And you can set this inside the actual details panel in Unreal, but you may want to do it here because it just gives you that bit more control. So further down, there's an interesting section that just says like, okay, you're on your own now, which is but here's a very interesting area to look at, and that's the temporal sample and the denoisers. And there's 2 different approaches to take here. And again, it gives you the idea about when you're working the editor in real time, you're going to be using this, which is specific real-time anti-aliasing, which is its downsides. So then you use sampling to mitigate some of the ghosting and artifacts that it can create. But then it says, look, the other aspect of ray tracing is that the ray tracing itself actually uses different denoisers as its main feature. So it uses fewer samples, but produces the equivalent result. And so, as if it was using more samples by softening them, by blurring and smoothing. So, with the movie render queue, as I said before, since you don't care about a real time performance and playability, you can actually disable these denoisers. You don't really need them, because if you've got the sampling count high enough, then it's worthwhile, and then it's worthwhile just disabling them. So Epic have provided you with the parameters to change, which is again worth looking at. And I wonder if many people actually realize this, and they just set everything to 1, to 2, turn everything on, and just throw the brute force of the card behind it, the power of the card behind it, just throw it at the renderer, which is fine. But when it comes to rendering, you really want to try and get the best image you can as economically as you can, because rendering takes time. And this is what I think people who are coming from film and TV can bring to this real-time environment. They're used to working with path tracing renderers like Arnold and RenderMan, and they're very used to trying to really optimize their rendering speeds to get the best quality, but without taking too much time. So Epic provides some parameters here to turn off, and then it says here that when the TAA is disabled and you've overridden the anti-aliasing method to none, it says it's a good idea to turn these off as well, because again, you've already got the sample count set high enough that you're not really going to get anything. And then of course it mentions again some like the ray tracing feature values are optimized for real-time usage, as in you're playing a game and moving around in real time. So you're not really going to be bothered about that if you're moving the render queue to generate frames. So again, it's worth looking at these parameters to maybe try and change them and get better performance and also better quality from your renderer. Okay, so we're back and I've done all my renders now, so it took quite a while. And what we're going to do now is compare them and just see the differences. Just see if any of the things that I've done actually do make a difference or not. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to use software called RV to do my comparison. I'm not going to look at individual frames. I want to look at the sequences. And RV is really the best thing for this. So if you're not familiar with this, RV is a software which is used by the movie industry, visual effects industry in particular, for comparing different dailies and sequences together, and it offers some amazing features. Now, it was an independent company, got acquired by Autodesk, and is now part of the Shotgun platform, but you can buy it on its own if you want to as well. I'll include some links in the description if you want to go and check it out, but I've been using this a while now, and I really like it, and it's ideal for comparing things. Anyway, I'll show you what I mean when we start bringing in our different frames. And let's start with what I would call the video capture. This is basically the rendered out from the sequencer only. And I've got my frames selected. I'm just going to drag them in here. And straight away, I can drag them into the viewport in RV. It says add source to session. And that's what I'm going to do. So when I now scroll, I've got everything there. I'm zoomed in a bit, so I'm going to zoom back out or just frame. So again, that just showed I can zoom in and out of a frame. I can even move it around if I want to. And what I can also do is I've got various controls here to look at color grading as well. So for example, I'm going to use the Rec 709 LUT, which is often one I use quite a bit. But again, I can quickly change this now to whatever I want. And RV supplies all the basic standards here pretty much out of the box. And what I'm also going to do is show the source list as well. So you get this little slider down here that tells you what sequence you're working on. And on the left, you got a panel here, and this is where you start building up your different layers. And I'll come to that in a moment. So this is straight out the render queue, the sequencer. And, you know, it looks all right. It's not bad. Got a few glitchy frames in here, but anyway, we only want really around about, I'm going to focus on this sequence here around about 59-ish to 60, where she opens her mouth and starts talking. So, but we can see here, this is okay. This is rendered 1920 by 1080. So that it looks okay. It looks reasonable quality and kind of what we would expect from the sequencer. So there's nothing too scary here. Now what we're going to do, we're going to bring in two different types of non-ray-trace renders. The first thing we're going to look at is what I call Epic's default. This was using the render presets that Epic included in their sample, and all I've done is just taken this sequence and then just applied those presets, and that's it. So now what I'm going to do, I only rendered out the first 100 or so frames of this, so I'm just going to select them on the monitor and drag them in. And now it gives me an option to what to do. I'm just going to add source to session. Now, you'll see here on the left, it's added them in as my inputs, and I can move these around. So I can prioritize them, and you can see that there's the difference between the two. But the real power of RV comes in when to look at comparing different sequences side by side. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to tools here and include tile. And straight away, I can see both sequences side by side. And again, when I move my cursor over, we can see I've put a little ED, which stands for Epic Default, the prefix of my file name, and I've put a non-RT here just so that I know what I'm looking at. And these are rendered in JPEGs as well. And again, if I just flick between them, I can quickly see which sequence I'm working on. I'm just going to make sure, yeah, I've got my Rec 709 turned on. So it's round about here I want to look at. So again, we can see this kind of working, and we can change this layout if we want to. But the really cool thing is we can change this to say go over. And once I do that, I've got my Epic default renders on top and my ones underneath it. And now what I can do, I can use this wipes feature. And if I move off to the left side, I get this kind of widget thing, and I can now drag across and compare both at the same time. And we can see just by looking at the two side by side the differences now. And again, I can zoom in and I can start looking. And then if I use my mouse wheel, I can just quickly move on a frame or two, is where they're the same. So I had some issues with the frames, but it doesn't matter. We can see the difference. So yeah, straight away, night and day maybe between the two, but we can see there's a definite difference there. Okay, so we can reset that back. Now I'm going to bring in the non-Raytraced version rendered again, but this time I'm going to bring in the same sequence, but with some extra parameters applied. And this is where I basically took the render presets and added my own things and increased the samples and so on. So I'm just going to select my frames, drag them in, and we've now got a third option down here as well. So it always adds them at the bottom. So again, I can just promote these up and you'll see they'll change. And of course, we can go back to that tiled. And now we've got all three lined up side by side. And then again, we can see what they look. And again, we just hover over and we can see the difference. So up here, the upper left, that's our output from the sequencer. This is the Epic default here on the upper right. And then down at the very bottom, this is our normal RayTraced, but non-Raytraced, but with the extra features. So the differences are, and I've got a few different kind of settings here that I've actually got. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly read them out, and I'll include them on the screen as well. So remember, when you output from the sequencer, you don't really get the opportunity to adjust any of the anti-aliasing or any of the kind of motion blur types. So if you've got to apply those parameters into the editor via the command line and then render out via the sequencer, you've got no additional control to do it after the fact. So I just took the scene as it was, vanilla-wise, straight out of the box from Epic. Now, when I added the Epic default render settings, this is what they had. For starters, the file format was a JPEG. The spatial sample count was 1. The temporal sample count was 7. There was no override for the anti-aliasing, and the render warm-up count was 8. And they only had 3 CVARs, console variables. The temporal AA anti-aliasing current frame rate, the upsampling, and the screen percentage. And the screen percentage was only set to 110. It's only really just essentially going 10% over current frame size, which is okay, but really you perhaps want to take it a little bit larger. But that was really it. Now, what I did on my version here, I decided to then change a few things. So what I did is I kept the spatial sample count at 1, but I upped the temporal sample count to 64. Then I decided to override the anti-aliasing and have the AA method as none because I've got the temporal sample count quite high. Increased the render warm-up count to 60. And then I kept exactly the same CVARs, except I upped the screen percentage to 150. And then I added 2. I added the depth of field quality to 4, and then the tone mapper quality to 5. And that was it. Now, I added the depth of field quality because I just wanted to see if it would make a difference, because I did have a focal point just around her face, really. And I wanted to see if it would make any difference around the outside here, even though I've got a very flat background and you can't really see that much. So let's look at them with the over feature. So now this is our movie render queue version PNG file. This reset our wipes. We can go reset our wipes up there. So now they're all back to normal. So now we can see this is basically our non-raytraced version. So we zoom in, and it's very hard to see any difference. But if we just zoom in slightly, really close, there's a very slight difference there. So look around the pores of the skin there. They're a little bit more defined on my version. And on the Epic one, they're just slightly blurred out. So this is the anti-aliasing. So I upped the sample count to 64. Could have gone higher. That's really better. You get a little bit more detail around here. Let's get around the nostril. But you know what? It's marginal. It really is marginal. If we look at the eyes, again, get a little bit more clarity in some of these little light reflections, which is kind of what we want a little bit, that extra little bit of glisten. So overall, I'd say that my version just gives a little bit more sharpness, just a little bit more definition around certain areas. Really, from this distance, it's really hard to tell. There's a line down here and you can barely notice it. So really, those extra, if we look at the depth of field, again, just on the outside there, is that really difference? Is it really going to make a difference to you? I'm not too sure it does. It's going to be, I think it's very subjective. So really, I guess what we can take away from that is, yes, we got a little bit of extra definition from the anti-aliasing, but in terms of everything else, really, there was not much in it at all. If we just prioritize the movie render queue version, that's obviously going to be very different. So if we get to the same frame here, about there, it's distinctly different. You know, we get the movie, the sequencer version is very washed out slightly, and there's a lot more color and definition here in the movie render queue. So that's already better straight away. So that's the difference. So the takeaway from that is really, did those extra CVARs make a difference? Well, yes, no, maybe. I think it's very subjective, really. Did the anti-aliasing have a difference? Well, yes, it did, and we could have even increased that a little bit further. And again, did the screen percentage make a difference? I mind 150. Yes, it probably did a little bit, but again, not really noticeable. Perhaps maybe if we had a different image, we would have seen something. It would have been a little bit more noticeable. So I would say at the moment there wasn't really much of a difference. Now what we're going to do is bring in the RayTrace version, and we'll see a significant difference now in this. So let's just drag this in, and now we've got the. Just going to clean this up in my views. Going to bring this to the top. So straight away, this is the way. Look at the difference here, and again, this just see them all side by side. So this is the difference now. Look how you can see the different versions side by side now. I mean, this is what I like about RV. You just wouldn't have this in any other software, and you can change this layout as well. So you can have it as a grid. You can have it all in a row. It's fantastic, and this is what I love about it. It's so cool. I've got one here I don't really need, so I'm just going to just take that out. That's better. And move the RayTrace to the top. And my RayTrace is on the top left. And again, if I hover over each one, you'll see the file name change here. So I'm always got an awareness of what it is I'm actually looking at. So there we go. So we can see them all side by side now, and this is great. And again, just use the mouse wheel and I can quickly scroll between them. Now we can see some differences here. These two, obviously, we just looked at. Again, very marginal. Definite difference between the one from the sequencer, and of course from the RayTrace version, there's a massive difference. We can see this. It's very obvious. Let's go to the over, and let's now look at our wipes and see what difference this actually makes. So again, we can see the difference here just by dragging the slider to and from. So again, the right one is the RayTrace version, the left is the non-Raytraced version, and again, you could argue it's night and day really in the differences. But actually, one thing, actually, let's just take a second to look at a few things. Again, now in terms of the RayTrace settings, let's just look at those for a moment. So I kept everything the same in terms of anti-aliasing, temporal sample count 64, override yes, render warm-up count 120. I kept everything the same in terms of the CVARs, screen percentage, depth of field quality, tone wrapper. I added a motion blur quality of 4 and a motion blur separate of 1. And then I included all these extra um, console variables that actually Epic suggested to turn off because you don't need them, because you're not doing a real-time render, as in through the editor, and you're using the movie render queue. You don't need these turned on because you've got anti-aliasing. The sample count's quite high, so I turned them off, and that's really about it. So really, the only difference is I've just turned on ray tracing. Turned on ray tracing through the project settings, and I also made sure that the ray tracing options are turned on in the lights and also the post processing volume. Again, we can see here the anti-aliasing is more or less the same, but you get a little bit more definition here in amongst the eye, and again this nice kind of little shadow in there as well, which is nice. And again, just a little bit more depth and color there in her face, which is what I like. And I kind of like this look. I get a nice this key light down the side here as well, so it gives her at the side of her face a little bit more definition. I quite like the dark shadow here. Really, that's kind of look I was really going for in the Paramount Butterfly. If we look at around the hair, we get a little bit more definition, although it does look at slightly odd here. I think it almost looks if it's not growing there on just the hairline, whereas this kind of looks a little bit better. So again, subjective maybe, but I'm kind of slightly leaning towards this maybe, which is the non-raytraced version. So yeah, so that's the difference. But what I would say, one of my takeaways is that yes, the raytraced version looks good and gives a really good definition, and I like the richness of the color here. Oh, I haven't got SG. I've got turn on my rec. There we go. And I like the slight richness and definition around the eyes as well. I just think that extra little bit of quality. It gives it a little bit more depth, I think, really. This non-ray trace version perhaps looks a little bit flat. Still got the key light there. But this one, just a standard render, just gives a little bit more clarity, I think. But again, you might disagree with me. It's completely subjective. I completely realise that. But what I would say is, are the differences enough to immediately go ray tracing? And I would argue perhaps not, because with this version here, which is the non-ray traced version, and the console variables are basically the same, I could probably get to this kind of level here with some post-processing, with just increasing the contrast, maybe adjusting the exposure, looking at the highlights. So I could take it into an editing package like Nuke or even DaVinci or something like, I'll do some basic color correction, and I could probably get to this here on the right. So really, is there a benefit in this context of going to ray tracing? I would say, well, vanilla out the box, yes, but are you going to be hindered by not having a ray tracing card if you were doing this sequence? Well, perhaps not. But again, there is a difference on the clothing as well. I think that is a big thing. We get some weird shadows here, but that could be just the way I've got my lights set up. So maybe I've just got to turn off some shadows. We've got a duplicate shadow here with double shadow. So maybe one of my lights is casting a shadow that I don't really need. Or maybe just make sure that the shadows are a bit softer. I made sure that in my lights for the ray tracing that I'd made the shadows to be softer, so they're more like an area light as opposed to just hard. So that can make a big difference. So again, it's all about adjusting the parameters, and ray tracing isn't going to do that for you. You've got to go in there and do it yourself. So really, that's my takeaway on this example. I think if there was a scene with a lot more going on in it, I think we would perhaps notice some differences. So I think really my takeaway in this particular example is that ray tracing, yes, good, but does it offer a significant advantage with this render? Perhaps not. But that's just me. But anyway, so that's my comparison with the Movie Render Queue and what you can get out of it. Now, if you want to know more about the Movie Render Queue and some of its secrets, because there's a lot in there, and I think it's still work in progress, I think, from Epic, and be very interesting to see what they're going to do with it in the new upcoming versions. But I'd really encourage you to check out this guy on YouTube, William Foucher. He's great, and he does some really good videos, and I look at his stuff quite a lot, and I'll readily admit I've stolen a few things off him as well. But check out his Movie Render Queue videos here, and the better depth of field one here as well. But he's great, and he's got some really good tips as well. So definitely encourage you to check him out. But anyway, what I'm going to do now, I might try and do some other scenes and look at some other scenes that I've been rendering with as well, and see if we can make some differences in that, because I do think obviously the subject matter will determine the differences and the output from the Movie Render Queue. So stay tuned to my channel, and I'll hopefully get some stuff up there soon. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope that was really useful to you, and I'll see you again next time.